As statistics about the mental health of our children began to emerge in summer 2020, it quickly became apparent that our children and teens are struggling. Rates of depression and anxiety among our youth are soaring like we haven't seen in our lifetime. Isolation, loneliness, disconnection, suicidal thoughts. These are not the kind of burdens that we want to see our children bearing. So how do we as parents and caregivers equip and protect and infuse our children with buoyancy and resiliency and hope? I'm Greg Godard, child psychologist. I work as a school psychologist with Prairie Rose Public Schools, and I also have a small private practice clinic as a child psychologist in Medicine Hat. Perhaps more significantly to this conversation, I have 3 kids of my own. One is an adult, one is turning 18 in a couple of weeks. He's graduating this year, and without telling too much of his story, the pandemic has been hard on him. My youngest is still in grade 9, and like a lot of parents of kids of that age in this city, I have been keeping a concerned eye on his well-being too. In my clinic, I've fielded a lot of calls from concerned parents. Just how worried should we be? Well, let me start by saying, pretty worried. Whether we like it or not, statistics are telling us that Canadian kids are more anxious and more depressed than before the pandemic. In some ways, it only makes sense. We don't need statistics to tell us that when we make sweeping adjustments to our children's lives, that it's going to affect their mental well-being. This video, I hope, is going to focus on resilience and hope and optimism. But before we get there, we need to be willing to take a bit of a deep dive into some of the doom and gloom or reality of our children's current mental health. And I want to acknowledge how hard this pandemic has been on many of them. Fact is, it's hit many of our kids hard. There are 3 areas in particular where it's impacted our kids. First, we have enforced constriction of their interpersonal connections, their social support network. Because of COVID-19 and the necessary pandemic restrictions, we've had to isolate our children. And of course, what is one of the greatest needs of our children and teens after they've had their basic needs for food and shelter and safety met? That of social connection, a sense of belonging to the wider world, especially our older children and teens. And they're being asked to cut themselves off from their social connections. Social distancing, isolation, sticking to your small cohorts, quarantine. This all runs counter to their innate developmental needs for social connection. In some ways, it's like saying all the vegetables in the world have been contaminated, so for the next foreseeable future, avoid eating vegetables. There's going to be an impact on our health. Secondly, what do our children and teens see when they look at the adults around them, their parents, their coaches, especially our younger children? Well, right now, they're seeing an emotional contagion of helplessness and vulnerability. A very fundamental need of our children for their sense of security and well-being is to be able to look out into the world around them at the adults who are in charge, their parents, their teachers, their coaches, the government, and see order, and see peace, and see that the people who are in charge really are in charge, that things are okay, that things are going to be okay. Our kids need to see that the world is consistent and stable and predictable and safe. But for the past year and more, they've been seeing a bit of a chaotic structure, disruptions to routine, societal fear, parental feelings of vulnerability and helplessness. So of course, our kids are going to be feeling more anxious and vulnerable and helpless themselves. I'd like to take just a few more minutes to talk about why these 3 needs, predictable structure and routine, social connection, and safe and stable adults are so vital. First, we have to come back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow was a psychologist in the 1940s who came up with a theory of developmental needs. It's a bit of a hierarchy where once the needs on the bottom level are met, children and adults can begin to pursue the higher level needs. And once those needs are met, they can continue to move up, etc. Each level of needs have to be met before the next level can be effectively pursued. If the needs at any level are not met, serious complications can arise. The first level is physiological: food, water, shelter, oxygen. Obviously, if these needs aren't met, we'll become sick or we'll die. Once these basic needs are met, we can begin to seek the second level of needs, which is safety. Children need to know that they're safe from danger. For adults, that might mean physical health, peace from war or domestic violence, financial security. If these needs aren't met, then we'll often experience stress or trauma, sometimes post-traumatic stress. And falling well into that need for safety for children is a sense of predictability and structure. Kids feel safest when they have predictable routines and consistent structure. Time and time again, we see situations where a child's perception of the world as safe and secure and predictable and consistent is disrupted, whether by divorce or the death of a pet or a loved one, or moving to a new city. And we've found that one of the best ways for kids to recover from these losses is to return to a relatively swift sense of normalcy and routine. We want kids to get back into their school, back to their day-to-day routine. Many psychological studies have found that people who experience trauma, like in war-torn countries or survivors of abuse, or really any sort of trauma, the people who recover the best and who cope well are those who have a very predictable sort of routine, consistent structure. In the midst of chaotic environments like war, people recover best when they know what's coming, when the things that can be controlled are controlled. So with our own children here in Alberta, what are we seeing with regard to routines? One of the only consistencies this year has been the inconsistency of how school is delivered. We've seen consistent disruptions: learning from home, learning from school. Close contact, you're home now for 12 days. Let's try learning from home for 2 weeks and then we'll see what happens based on numbers. Their school routine has been really unstable and unpredictable for more than 12 months. And at home, well, for many of them, that routine has also been thrown out of whack. All right, so that's structure, not the best situation for our kids. The second recent problem I'd like to acknowledge is social disconnection. As I was saying earlier, one of the most basic needs of all human beings, once our physiological needs and our safety needs have been met, is that sense of belonging to the outer world. When I'm confident that I'm going to be fed, that I'm going to have a roof over my head tonight, that the world is safe and secure, I can begin to seek out community and love and belonging. Here's where some of the pandemic restrictions is actually arresting our children's development. We're being forced by this virus to cut off personal time with our loved ones, with our relatives, with our friends, and that's having an impact. Intriguingly, what do you think Maslow's theory predicted would happen if we don't allow our children to have that social connection, to have that sense of belonging to the wider world? Maslow predicted our kids would experience anxiety and depression. Finally, last doom and gloom topic. Let's look briefly at our kids' needs to be able to see stable and regulated adults when they look around them. From the moment they're born, and even before that, in utero, our children are referencing the outer world, listening to their mother's heartbeat, listening to their mother's soothing tone of voice. We know that newly born infants can pick out their mother's voice from that of other women. They're attuned to and recognize that soothing voice they've been hearing as they were developing. And then, from the moment of birth on, science has found insurmountable evidence of what we call social referencing. To know how they should feel about things, children constantly reference the adults around them. They use the emotional signals of the people who are in charge to regulate their own response to people and situations. You've probably heard a lot about self-regulation and co-regulation, kind of the big buzzwords around schools and mental health these days. And it's absolutely true. Kids from birth to adulthood will look to the adults around them to gauge how they should feel. They hear a loud bang outside of the school. Where's the first place they look? Their teacher's face. And if they could put words to that instinctive response, it would probably be something like, should I be scared? It depends on my teacher. If he's feeling scared, I'm feeling scared. If she's looking around the room with wide eyes, my heart rate is not going to go down very soon. And right now, what our kids are seeing when they reference the adults around them is a lot of emotional dysregulation in their parents, their teachers, their coaches, frustration, instability, fatigue, exhaustion, fear, vulnerability. They're overhearing their mom on that phone call to her relatives, frustrated or annoyed or concerned about the next wave or the new variant. There was a psychoanalyst in the 1950s named Karen Horney, and she said there's 3 human responses that we have when we're faced with feelings of vulnerability and helplessness. Moving against each other, which is what we see on social media all the time these days, high conflict. Moving toward each other, which is considered the most psychologically healthy response, trying to connect, and which has been really hampered by pandemic restrictions, or moving away from each other and isolating ourselves. And this, and I think this is a bit tragic, is where our kids have been forced to turning away from each other and becoming increasingly isolated and feeling increasingly alone. All that having been said, yes, we should be concerned about our children and our teens' well-being. There's a lot of factors playing heavily against them. So how can I sit here and trumpet hope and optimism for our youth after all that? Let me reply from the field of school crisis response. One of the most important maxims for mental health professionals coming into a school to respond to a crisis is this: the norm is recovery. In other words, even after witnessing a terrifying or traumatizing event, such as terrorism or a school shooting or a teacher dying of a heart attack in the middle of class, even after being proximally close to a legitimately traumatizing event, the norm is recovery. The specific statistic that crisis response uses is 5%. Approximately 5% of kids who've been exposed to trauma will require prolonged, intensive professional help. The good news about that is, of course, is that 95% of kids, or 19 out of 20, will return to, with time and effort, return to pre-traumatic baseline. That doesn't mean they are not forever impacted by that event. It doesn't mean they will simply walk away as if nothing has happened. It will impact them, but it means they'll turn out okay, and they'll make it through stronger. And I think that's what I really want to focus on, is that stronger part. We often hear about post-traumatic stress. We don't as often talk about post-traumatic growth or positive psychological changes that happen after trauma. Changes such as the way that we perceive ourselves, the way that we look at our social relationships, our perspective on life. Big picture here for us in the midst of this pandemic is that for the most part, our kids are going to be okay. They are hurting, but they will heal. I want to assure you of that. The brain and body want to heal. However, it's important for us to remember that it's not only the passage of time that will heal them, it does take effort. It takes work to heal from cumulative stress, from isolation, from disrupted routine, from anxiety. It will take work. And a lot of that work will occur naturally within our children as our kids process their own experiences. But there are some things you can do as parents and caregivers to help foster and nurture that natural healing process. Let's go back to those 3 factors: structure and routine, social connection, and stable and secure adults. These are really important for us to remember as we guide our kids through and out the other side of this pandemic. You've probably heard about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. My friend and colleague Anna Schlosser talked about this in her video for this series, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But essentially, there were studies done in the US about 20 years ago in which they found that children who experience very difficult life events early in their childhood, such as abuse or neglect or the loss of a parent, it dramatically impacts their health and well-being. This study, done by the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, eventually settled on 10 specific ACEs. And the more of these 10 ACEs that a child experiences, the more severe and dramatic the negative impact, including a foreshortened lifespan and all sorts of health complications and quality of life diminishment. ACEs impact brain anatomy, they can change genetic expression, and they often lead to delays in social development, emotional development, cognitive development, and the list goes on. Often in mental health assessment, we now actually take a tally of how many ACEs a child has experienced before we even begin to assess how they're doing. But much more recently, only in the past 2 years, researchers have been looking at something called PACEs. Researchers like to come up with their own acronyms so that they stay in the record books as their discovery. So there's several different definitions of the word PACEs. Some people call them positive childhood experiences. The one that I like is protective and compensatory experiences. And these are experiences that occur in a child's life that can make them resilient, can actually buffer them against life's difficulties, including those 10 ACEs that are so dangerous to so many. And researchers are finding that when safeguarded by these PACEs, children are nowhere near as wounded by the difficult experiences that life can throw at them, including ACEs. These researchers are looking at what factors we can try to provide for our children, that we can try to arm them with to help them flourish. Not just survive, but flourish. And the answer is, as usual, deceptively simple. All these millions of dollars of research and professors' time comes up with the answer that what they need is connection. Connection with family and friends. The list is actually a bit more complicated, and it's still being developed. As academics come up with theories and strategies, it often is several years until it filters into the practical application among therapists and parents. But they've kind of come up with about the 7 most common PACEs that have been found to actually offer protection for children, to help them weather the worst of life storms. 1, they feel able to talk about their feelings with their family. So they are able to understand and put into words these difficult and complicated feelings they're going through, but more importantly, they feel like they can actually share these feelings with their family. 2, they believe their family stands behind them during difficult times. So one of the protective factors that's going to keep our kids okay through this difficult time is that they believe that we as family will stand behind them through this difficulty. 3, they enjoy participating in community activities. They're connected with the community outside of the home. 4, they feel a sense of belonging in junior high and high school, or if they're homeschooled, with children around the same age. 5, they feel supported by their friends. 6, and this one's interesting, they have connections with at least 2 supportive adults outside of the family who take a genuine interest in them. And 7, they feel safe and protected by an adult in the home. Again, psychological research sometimes kind of trumpets findings that are like, duh, but here it is. If I as a child believe that people are safe, that people will support me, if I believe that I am interesting, that I am lovable, that I have worth and significance, then I can withstand the most intense difficulty life can throw at me. I'm hoping if you come away from this video with only one nugget of information, it's that one. That you can help protect your child from the traumatic impact of cumulative stress, like a global pandemic, social isolation, childhood depression, suicidality, by working to ensure they feel protected, connected, loved, and supported. As a parent, you probably won't need to hear too many strategies about how to make this happen. You were equipped with those skills the moment you welcomed that child into your home. But here are a few ideas I'd like to suggest. First, encourage communication about life, about the world, about their feelings. Emotions can be confusing and swirling and changing and intense and overwhelming, but you can help to contain those emotions with language, with children and teens of all ages. Like the inimitable Mr. Rogers said, whatever is human is mentionable, and whatever is mentionable is manageable. And this was before a whole lot of neurological research that has shown that our emotions, this is an oversimplification, but our emotions reside within the limbic system of our brain. And we experience them on a cognitive level in the right side of our brain. And essentially, language resides in the left half of the brain, where we use order and containment and structure. So putting difficult ideas and feelings into words actually helps to shrink and understand and manage those feelings. And if your children are able to articulate their difficult emotions or share some of their difficult experiences, it's going to be important for you to remember to silence your inner critic or any impulse you may have to correct them or reassure them or moralize or judge or correct. This is not a teachable moment. Listen to them with wholehearted attention. I'm going to talk more about wholeheartedness in a moment, but essentially set aside your own distractions. Focus on their verbal and their non-verbal communications. Make it okay make it comfortable to talk about the uncomfortable without judgment or criticism. This is tricky as a parent. A practical example of trying to set aside your own critic and your own responses, it might be if a child says to you, you're always yelling at me. And my own response might be, oh my goodness, like you want to hear yelling, I could show you yelling. But I was just talking in like a kind of a clear, firm voice. That wasn't yelling. But if I say that, my child doesn't feel that I heard them. One of the most important things in any human communication is not just that I hear you, but that you feel heard by me. So if a child says to me, you're yelling at me all the time, as a parent, I need to silence that response of, no, I'm not, I'm really not. I just need to help him feel that I understand his concern. Okay, it seems to you like I'm yelling all the time. It seems to you like I never speak calmly and politely and peacefully. Without sarcasm, without judgment, without a sense of there's always that tone to our voice which can come across like you're wrong. What I need to say, without saying to him, you know what, you're right. I do yell all the time. I'm not agreeing. I'm just understanding. I'm saying, okay, it feels to you like as a dad, I'm always yelling at you. And maybe there's something else going on beneath that. Maybe my face. Maybe when I'm using really calm, stern words like this, I've got a wrinkled and furrowed brow, and that feels like yelling to my son. So oftentimes it's important to sort of wait, especially if while I'm listening to my son, I've got an answer primed and ready to fire at him. I'm not listening. So I need to set aside that voice and try to hear it, and then to say to him, I hear you. Sometimes that's all they need. Conversation's over. They feel so much better because I said, okay, it feels to you like I'm yelling at you. I don't want to yell at you. Second, with younger kids, with all ages, but with younger kids in particular, you may need to be an emotional coach. Let them know it's okay to feel this way, that feelings are real, that they're temporary, that they will pass. Emotions are not necessarily problems to be solved, but they are human experiences to be witnessed, to be shared. One of the best kind of responses you can give to your kids, especially when their emotions threaten to overwhelm you, is, I hear you. I'm here for you. I will stand by you during this difficult time. Notice I'm not trying to assuage or solve that emotion. Third, limits. Provide fair and clear rules and limitations for your home. They should be sensible, they should be consistent, although they should change as kids get older. Consequences for breaching the rules should be fair and reasonable and clear, and kids should be afforded the opportunity to correct their mistakes. And remember to model the behavior you want to see in your children. For example, you shouldn't be on your cell phone all night while telling your kids to watch their screen time. Fourth, create healthy routines for your children. Meal times as a family, consistent bedtimes, sharing in family activities like board games, bike rides, family walk. Remember that familiar and predictable structure and routine is crucial for your child's sense of security and stability. Fifth, encourage healthy social connection outside of the family. Your kids, especially your teens, but kids of all ages really, need those social connections, those supportive relationships that become their social support network. Having adult mentors outside of the family actually reduces risky behavior and increases academic success. As restrictions lift, try to encourage your kids to engage in sports and community activities. Sixth, remember that your kids are always social referencing you. They are looking to you for how they should respond to a given situation or person. I encourage parents to remember the maxim that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail. Be the thermostat, not the thermometer. He was writing to the church of his day saying, don't just tell the world around you all the things they're doing wrong. Don't just gauge the temperature of their behavior. Rather, change their behavior by being the example for them. Be that thermostat. Similarly, as parents, your emotional state will be the temperature setter for the children around you. We help to regulate our kids' emotions. So, take care of yourself first. As the adage says, you can't pour from an empty cup. Make sure you're working on your own mental health, on your own well-being, your exercise, your diet, your sleep hygiene, your mindfulness, so that you have the capacity to keep yourself in a regulated state. Set aside your own stresses and be with your kids so that you can help to set the temperature and co-regulate their emotions. And finally, I want to come back to that 1950s psychoanalyst I was talking about, Karen Horney, because she came up with a concept called wholeheartedness. You've probably heard Brene Brown or others talking about it nowadays, but when Karen Horney developed this concept, she was referring to the idea that we need to set aside all of our distractions. Our internal distractions, like how tired we are of this pandemic, the stress, the fatigue, feeling done. We need to set aside those internal distractions, and our external distractions, our cell phone, the doorbell, the things that might distract us from an interactive conversation with our kids. And we need to come alongside them and join them in that moment and try to be fully with them, engaging fully in their communications. There's our children's perspective on the world, and then there's our own parental perspective. But there's a third perspective, and it's that shared perspective that you can have with another person. In psychology, we call that intersubjectivity, because psychologists need to come up with words for everything. Intersubjectivity is when I'm able to set aside my own personal distractions, my own anxiety, my own sadness, and when I'm able to look into your eyes and hear your words and see your facial expressions and your gestures, when I'm able to hear your heart, if that's not too corny. That's intersubjectivity, that shared perspective. And when it happens between a parent and a teen, between a parent and a child, it's beautiful. It's that space where a child can know, I have an attuned parent who is stepping outside of their own perspective into my shared perspective, joining me in my state, willing to share a perspective with me. And importantly, that's where dyadic reparation occurs. When you make a mistake, when you screw up as a parent or a caregiver, and we all do, when your stresses and distractions get in the way, when you're not the parent you want to be, the place where you can make reparation, the place where you can re-engage is that intersubjectivity. You can repair that relational rupture. I am coming out of my world into our shared world. I'm engaging with you. I'm coming alongside to reconnect with you and to listen to you wholeheartedly. Not just say sorry, but share sorry. So please remember, as difficult as this pandemic is on both us and our kids and teens, as wearying and fatiguing as it is, and as anxious and depressed as our kids may be right now, you still have the power to equip them with paces, with resilience and strength and grit, so that they emerge from this pandemic and then from every difficulty that life throws at them later with post-traumatic growth more than post-traumatic stress. And remember that if things get too difficult for you as a parent or for your children, it's always important to reach out for help to your social support system, or if you need it, for professional help. Thank you.